All right, so today we're gonna go over the 5 most common problems with making your own composite part and how to fix them. All right, so the first most common problem is running into pinholes in your part. I have a part here, which Xavier will get a close-up of. It's got pinholes in through here. It's little tiny air voids. This is on the bottom surface of the part. So once you release it off your mold or off your part, you have small little pinholes. That's probably the most common problem that I run into. And there's a couple ways to fix it. First would be adding a layer of resin on top of it. You could either squeegee in resin, the same resin you were using, like if you're using 2000, use more 2000. Or I've been using this 5-minute epoxy, it comes in 2 parts. Mix it up real quick, it's clear. Spread it in just the small little pinholes if you have a small affected area. If you have a large area, you might as well sand the part and put a whole nother layer of resin on top of it. Other than that, you can also use clear coat. That's what we did with the Xavier's hood. We had a couple pinholes in the outside of it. Just clear coat it, hit it heavy. If there's any pinholes, you can always tap them with a little needle or something small and get them to fill in. And then later you could always wet sand and buff it if it's got any like weird wobbliness to the top of it. Another thing you can do is you can fill, if it's got some slightly bigger pinholes, fill with this glass microspheres from fiberglass, part number 22. So these are like little tiny glass beads, and you can mix these with epoxy, polyester, or vinyl ester resins. Just stick with the same resin you have so it'll actually, work with your part. But same thing as gel coat. Using another coat of resin, you can just mix this with resin to make it a little thicker, fill your little voids or pinholes, and then just wait for it to dry and sand it smooth. And then finally, one thing you can do to avoid getting them in the first place is you could change your layup techniques into doing something like pre-preg, or you could add in a layer of gel coat, clear gel coat first. 99% of all the parts that you'll see out there on the market that are carbon fiber will have probably a couple layers of gel coat. That's like that really deep depth of clear that you see to a lot of those parts. Or if you've seen a cracked carbon fiber part, it's got like a thick, like 1/8 inch thick layer of clear stuff. That's probably some clear gel coat. It's not gonna add to the rigidity, like structural rigidity of your part, especially if you're using something that's slightly flexible like epoxy. So I avoid using it if I can. If it's like a part that is gonna be really stiff and it's gonna be really visible, like a hood or something like that, it might be worth using some of this. But if you're doing race car stuff, you don't really care about small little pinholes, I would just stick to not using it. And then my final fix for this will be using this pinhole filler. This is like mainly used for body guys. So when you're mixing your mud, you can get little pinholes, like little air bubbles in your mud. And it'll dry on the car, sand it smooth, and you'll reveal little tiny air pockets. And they'll look very similar to these. So what you can do is you can take this stuff, and actually I'll grab a little rag. So you can take this stuff on a rag, just a little bit of it. And then what you do is you swirl it into your pinholes. And this will fill them, so if you clear coat the part, they won't stick out, but it does leave them light gray. You can see these little spots. So at least it's gray and not something like pink or something like that, but it will fill them. Not the best option, but it's a quick, easy fix if you're making your own part and you're not too worried about it looking 100%. And yeah, so that's it for tip number 1. All right, the second most common problem that we run into would be air voids in your part, similar to like this. Essentially like a large pinhole, but not something you can fill easily with like pinhole filler or any of these other options. I mean, you can use like the 2-part thicker epoxy or more resin to fix these as well. But if you use the gel coat and you run into air pockets, you'll still have air pockets. They'll just be behind gel coat. So then it's like really hard to fix. It'll be a clear bubble in your part, so that's not good. If you're doing a wet layup and you're just letting it air dry, I would definitely use a vacuum on it. If you can, put your part and the mold into like an envelope bag, or just use regular like vacuum on the part. If it's holding it in, it's gonna release all of like the air out of the part, most of the air out of the part, and you'll end up with a much better finish, and it should get rid of all of these pinholes. Well, not pinholes, air voids. Another thing you can do is try and use a slightly less complex shape if possible. Any super sharp corners in molds are gonna be prone to air voids. So anytime the carbon has to like really curve a lot, you're asking a lot of your of the actual carbon fibers themselves, that can definitely cause a problem. Another thing is making sure that your carbon is loose enough in the mold, because if it's too tight, or if you're doing something, a part similar to, let's see, similar to these belly pans we've been making, around these little recesses, so in the mold, these sit proud of the mold. So we have to make sure that the carbon that's sitting around here has a lot of slack around each of these.
So you essentially just add extra carbon?
Yeah, because otherwise, then if the carbon was sitting across these, it would be pulled really tight, and then you definitely get some air pockets, especially around these edges. And we've rounded the corners a little bit, so it's not, it's less likely to get air pockets and stuff like that, but we've now made like 12 of these, so we're getting better and better each time we make them. So if you need to repair a part like this, a good way to do it is with the thicker gel coat and the micro combined, because that'll give you like a really thick, almost like a putty, like a body filler. But you can come in here and fill these guys, and you have to make sure that your combination will actually dry clear, but even if it's a little hazy, at least it'll be fixed. Issue number 3 is getting hairs, visible hairs in your part from your brushes. The first way to got this would be get really nice brushes. But if you're making a lot of parts, that gets expensive. Other than using really nice brushes, my second technique is actually, we got this from a comment on our YouTube channel, and I've been doing it ever since, but get the liquid, the thin style super glue, and you just run it across the base of your brush, and it'll soak in to like the bottom 1/4 inch of the brush hairs. Then you let that bad boy dry for like 5-10 minutes. And then you go all the way around the back as well. And you won't get any of these little brush bristles falling out. Because once they fall out and they get in your part, it's easy to not notice them when it's wet, but once it dries, there'll be like a tan line in your part. And no hairs, guys, no hairs.
Goes to show. We read your comments if you have some nice tips in there.
And if you ever watch any of our videos and you go into the comments, look for Deathstroke. He comments no hairs on literally every video. He's a real OG. So the next way to avoid getting visible hairs in your part would be to lay your part in dry. I know you've seen us use the technique of like laying the resin in first and then laying the part on top of that. And that is very useful for a lot of applications, especially applications where the carbon has to sit on like a high wall and it would just fall off. But on other applications, you can just lay the carbon in dry first and then wet it in from the back. And then even if you do lose a hair, it's in the middle of your part. And finally, what you can do is don't use a brush as much. You can use these nice rollers. Make sure you have a roller that is not gonna pull off hairs into your part. Make sure it's compatible with the resin you use. 100% polyester blend is what you're looking for. Or use squeegees. They sell these at Fiberglass. Yeah, so using brushes when you can is fine, but like rollers and squeegees definitely can help mitigate the risk of getting little hairs on your part. All right, number 4 is your part stays tacky even after the cure cycle. So like 24 hours later or however many hours later, read your resin container, get all the information off it. But if it's still tacky after the cure cycle, you probably did something wrong. It could be a combination of things, but most common, I would say, would be not mixing correctly. So like when you're mixing your resin and your hardener, a lot of them will say like at least a minimum of mixing. A minimum of 1 minute of mixing is actually a long time. Like a minute of just sitting there and stirring. Like I've counted in my head and I'd Ryan do a counter and it was like 40 seconds and it was actually like still going. But so use an actual timer for at least a minute every time you're mixing. I ran into a problem on a part I recently made, and we spent another day trying to fix that part because of this issue, exactly. So make sure that you mix it correctly. And then the second thing would be, make sure you're mixing it at the correct temperature. System 2000, epoxy resin likes to be at a minimum of 73 to air dry. Get a good thermometer that will actually read temperature of your shop and the humidity and stuff like that.
I'm so proud of you. We came a long way.
I know, yeah. Well, now that we're doing this like full time, we're finding a lot of problems real fast.
Like, I know a lot of people commented in the old videos about this stuff.
Yeah. We're still not using gloves, but you know.
Hey, baby steps. Who would have thought?
Look at us. So if you do have a part like this and it's already done and it's tacky and you can't go back and mix your stuff correctly, what you can do is you can let it sit for another cure cycle. Do one more whole cure cycle, so another 24 hours or however long your resin takes to dry, and make sure it's at least at minimum temperature. Get it as hot as you can in that room. And so let it dry for another cure cycle, and then if it's still tacky at that point, keep it in that room and mix another properly mixed time and temperature-wise thing of resin and lay it on and just let that cure. If that fully cures on the top layer, it'll cure that stuff underneath it eventually and it'll be okay. It's the only real way to save that part. The other thing is make sure that your ratio is correct as well. Like System 2000 is 3:1 with 2060 hardener, but if you use a 2020 hardener, it's 4:1. If you mess that up, that can also result in the same thing. You can get a sticky, tacky part that's not fully hardening. The fifth most common problem that we run into is weave distortion on the actual carbon part. So actually it's probably better on this. So the weave could get messed up like this, or if it snags on something on like the table that you're messing with, and it's really highlighted here with the carbon Kevlar. But if your weave gets all jacked up like this and it sits in your part, and you have an otherwise pretty straight part, it'll look not so nice. But so one thing you can do is you can grab the fibers on each end and pull them and then straighten it out. So if you find the fiber that's all jacked up, you pull it. You do that to all of them in that area. And then you do the same thing the other direction. Just do it a couple times, work with it, but work with it while it's in your mold or on your part. Because once it's hardened, there's no doing this, obviously. And another way to avoid that happening is you can, well, the other version of it is if you get like fraying of your part, and like some of these strands will like land in your part. And if you're laying, like fraying of like the actual, so if you're cutting something and it's not at exact 90, if you're doing it at an angle, you're gonna cut across these bits. And they're always, you can see like they wanna pull out. But so one thing you can do is the edge of your part, you can tape. So you can run tape on the inside of it. And then when you cut across that, obviously, you're not gonna get any fraying. But the problem you run into here is you can't really move it or distort the weave at all because it's stuck to this tape. Even the bit of carbon that's not against the tape, so even this carbon that's next to the tape is not gonna move as easily as the stuff out here. So if you have a really complex mold, this will become an issue, but there's a fix for that as well. What you can do is you can just cut little reliefs every half inch or so. Cut less if you don't need it as pliable, and cut more if you need it more pliable, but that will at least keep it, from fraying out and getting like some of these little things back in your part, and it'll also give you some flexibility. And then finally, if you have to cut like a crazy curved part and you need to lay it in your mold, and you have to cut something like this, You can already see this wants to fray. Any like little bit of moving around, they're just gonna keep coming out. So one little trick you can use is you can spray the back half with Super 77 and let that bad boy dry a little bit. Oh gosh, it's very sticky. We'll come back in a minute. So our Super 77 is tacked up. And what you can do is you can cut your part, your curve out. And it's not gonna make it impossible to mess up the weave, but you can do a lot more with it without it popping out. So you can do this, set this in your part, it'll stay a curve. But if you do too much wetting it out and messing with it with a brush or something like that, it's gonna start bringing them out and it'll loosen up the Super 77, so just be mindful of that. And if that becomes a real issue, then you probably wanna go to like a resin infusion or a pre-preg part. So if you wanna make your own part and you wanna test out some of these techniques as to making your parts perfect, go on to industrygarage.com. You can pick up one of our DIY kits. We sell them in small and large. We also have a new run of Street Bandito shirts on there. So if you guys want to support us, best way to do it. We really appreciate everybody watching these videos, helping us become full tubers. Until next time, we out.